So we're
Oddać
running
honor
1 minute
tłumaczom,
late.
pani Dominika Gajewska, pan Artur
Just to
Zapałowski.
introduce our
Dziękujemy bardzo.
interpreters, thank you very much.
I rozpoczynamy kolejny panel.
To them.
Potrzeba alternatywy. Tę część
we
otworzy
are
Kata
starting
Czato
a panel
z
entitled
Węgier
Need for
ze
Alternatives.
swoją prezentacją
Our
Seksizm
first
w
speaker will
artystycznym
be Kata
szkolnictwie
Czato from
wyższym.
Hungary
Bardzo proszę.
with a presentation titled Sexism in Higher Art Education.
Welcome everyone. My name is Kata Czato and I came from Budapest and I am a puppeteer. I was graduated in Białystok in Poland, but now I am working mostly in Hungary. I was a teacher in the University of the Theatre and Film Arts in Budapest. And I would like to speak about this topic because we had a lot of problems about sexism. Before our students occupied the university, we had some cases what was not clarified. And the whole procedure was, let's put it in this way, it was a little bit problematic. We had no ethic code, there was no one to where the victim could turn to, and so on. But before I'm jumping to the middle of this topic, I would like to share a definition. May I? Maciek, co się stało? Teraz nie funkcjonuje. Czy ja mogę poprosić
Maciek, what's
troszkę
happening?
pomóc?
Help me.
Marcin, Michał? Nie? O, super. A, to oni idą, ale nie... Ja widzę, że oni patrzą na mnie. Ja mam kontakt z nimi. Tak?
I have
Tak,
eye
tak.
contact with the guy. Please help
Oni
me.
pracują nad tym.
They're working on it.
Ja mówię, a potem pokażę.
So I'm gonna
wszystkie.
speak and then
I
I'll
will
show you
speak and later
afterwards.
on I will show the pictures, okay? So, here is the definition. There. I am pointing. Oh, no. Next. Oh, here it is. Yes, thank you. Discriminatory or abusive behavior towards members of the opposite sex. Sexism is prejudice or discrimination based on a person's gender. Sexism can affect any gender, but it is particularly documented as affecting women and girls. It has been linked to stereotypes and gender roles and may include the belief that one of the gender is intrinsically superior to another. Extreme sexism may foster misogyny, sexual harassment, rape, and other forms of sexual violence. Discrimination in this context is defined as the discrimination towards people based on their gender identity or the gender or sex differences. A notable example of this workplace inequality. Sexism may arise from social or cultural customs and norms. No? Michał? Proszę. Nic. A nie idzie do przodu.
It's not happening.
Yes, please. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Which way? Over here. Okay, and that way. Thank you. The origins of the word sexism are unclear. The term was first used by feminist movements in the second half of the 20th century, probably by analogy with the word racism. What is sexism? An abuse of power? Oh. Discrimination based on gender? And how can this definition be understood in higher education in the arts? The biggest problem is that in art universities, especially theater art universities, this word, or the older meaning of this word, was inherently accepted. After all, most of us have come across the analogy of he who goes worrying shouldn't cry when he gets fucked, or you find yourself on the casting couch. Ergo, The hierarchy of theater and the social category built around it immediately placed our profession in a sexist and within that a very sharply sexist sense. So translated, a young person who chooses the theater profession is suggesting to the world that she is frivolous person. When my father found out that I wanted to be an actress, he spent years trying to talk me out of it by saying that you had more sense and you are not that kind of girl. But does it really have to be like this way? Is talent really decided on casting coaches? Moreover, in higher education institutions of arts, this issue needs to be announced for different reasons. The educational structure of the Budapest University of Theatre and Film Arts is or was based on the master-apprentice relationship for 155 years now. And we Hungarians were and are very proud of this. But what does it really mean? If we take this structure under the microscope, then I would have to say that there is one man who is the master of life and death, and that is the head of the class. It is his theatrical tastes that must be catered for, it is his mood that the students are subjected to, and it is all governed by the nexus that the class teacher has with his students. As well as his personality, he makes the student feel supported or, on the contrary, given a growth ride during the student years. And this counts for a lot. And this person is the one who is responsible for the future of the graduating students through his or her own personal knowledge. Whether that person leaves university with a contract or starts their professional career hanging in a vacuum of artistic existence, so everyone tries to be as accommodating as possible to that person, to that power. Not to mention that during the university years, it's the head of the class who determines what roles a person gets, what opportunities they can further their education thanks to different directors, lecturers. Moreover, gender issues are raised from other perspectives in higher education. After all, we are talking about young adults who often do not yet have a fully formed gender identity, or young people who came to these educational institutions who are not yet ready to take on their gender identity. In the case of the University of Budapest, I have often had listened to from my colleagues telling me that starting from the education methodology, you have to first destroy the personalities and then rebuild them, so that the way become good actors and professionals. I don't want to go into that analysis of this methodology now because I think it deserves another whole conference, but I find the system about gender very problematic. Yes, these institutions of higher education want to admit people who are particularly sensitive. It is difficult to draw the line between aloofness, fear, chastity, or even virginity. So the question remains, how much right does a teacher, even if he or she is entirely benevolent towards his or her students, have to interfere in these matters that fundamentally determine personality and, in some cases, gender? It is interesting that many women and men who have graduated from the university and are currently working as active theater professionals admit that they cannot look back on their university years with a completely happy feeling, because they were also brought down to the earth, both in terms of their humanity, gender, and self-confidence, from which they found it very difficult, or in some cases impossible, to recover. By this I mean that they carry memories of a sentence or a situation after a class, an exam or a test that they cannot move on front, cannot forget, cannot steal with in the right place. In fact, They were already using these words when looking for applicants at the admissions stage. He'll be good because he's quiet masculine, or he's too feminine, so we'd rather not let him go on the next round. But there have been some heads of department who have applied by looking at the current theater offerings, and where they thought they will be must vacancy in 5 years, they let an applicant with character and personality go through. The most extreme was when applicants were hired based on hair color or height length. Here I would like to share a personal memory from my early days at University in Białystok as a student. I was setting up for my first directing class when the professor teaching the class looked at me and asked me what I was doing in the classroom. I didn't speak perfectly Polish yet, so I asked him what he said. He repeated the question and added that he thought I should be in another classroom. Still believing that there was something I didn't understood linguistically, I continued to wonder. Here I see my classmates. There's sorting class on the timetable, so this is where I belong, I said. He looked at me and he gave me his view in the form of riddle. The riddle was, what are the 3 professions that are not done by women? I did not know the answer. He came to me rescue. The cook, the conductor, and the theater director. Then he added, don't take it personally, but there are no outstanding women in these professions. Needless to say, I felt immediately immensely humiliated and helpless. I didn't even think about how I could come up with a pithy retort. I would have liked to sink down, feel immensely ashamed, and at the same time slap the dear professor on the face, which I did not do. During my studies, I had many arguments with this professor, and our relationship was not entirely unmanageable. However, whenever he could, he hinted, or in a way that could be construed as hinting at his view of a woman. Each time I tried to avoid or ignore this is in a funny way afterwards, but each time I needed extra energy and I had to use new ideas. To be fair, years later, when he himself watched one of my successful premiere in Białystok, he was able to congratulate me by saying that I had done a pretty good job as a woman and that I could now call myself a director, which I could not have taken as a compliment. I have to say that these quiddles, seemingly insignificant but all the more annoying situations did not diminish after my university's years. After all, the director is at the top of the theater hierarchy, in a good way. But in many cases, especially in the first job when you are not yet known, the director has to be quite flexible and, above all, humorous in his face of male chauvinism manifestations. My most intimate experience are in Balkans, but I won't go into them now. I'll be very happy to tell you about them in a coffee break. Of course, these symptoms, phrases, situations, feelings are not only those that arise in relations to women. Those who are perhaps even more exposed to these phrases and situations are homosexuals. Here I would like to point out that I am not talking here about the judgment of university teachers, but about the background staff and fellow students who work in the universities during their university's years. And after university, also mainly the technical colleagues who are supposed to work under our supervision. But there are cases, and I know of cases, where actors have sent feedback from the stage to my colleague directors that was related to their sexual orientation. Interestingly, my heterosexual colleague has never reported such a case. And I would also like to take a moment to point out that sexism is followed by abuse. I would like to say, even though that there is a little literature on sexism compared to abuse, compared to Me Too, that for me sexism belongs to the same category of abuse. Precisely because it creates a state of vulnerability in which one cannot participate as an equal. The sufferer is being punished for something that they cannot help. There is another side of this problem. What happens when someone is unjustly accused? Unfortunately, these cases also happen because sexism is still a taboo subject. As is sexual abuse, there is not yet a culture of how and in what way to go after such a case and how to take a stand. That is why I think it is particularly important to carefully investigate and deal with these cases like this. Since I like solutions and suggestions, I would like to look positively into the future. I have started to collect ideas on what solution could lead to avoiding sexist situations. I consider a code of ethics very important. In Hungary, thanks to Me Too, many institutions, both theaters and educational institutions, already have a code of ethics, which includes all the processes to investigate such cases. It is important that there are consequences for the cases investigated, as there is nothing worse than when a person cannot get rid of a person who keeps harassing them with these sexist statements and actions. Also, if it is the other way around and someone is accused of being defenseless, the accuser should also be able to get his or her just punishment. In both cases, it is difficult to prove, which is why this is a particularly sensitive issue. I also think it is important that the community that deals with the cases should include outside experts, in addition to university staff, to ensure that the decision is as impartial as possible. The procedure must be established that insurance discretion, at least until the end of the hearing, and is sufficiently transparent to ensure that other students are informed of the decision and not just guided by gossip on the corridor. One of the most important rules in that is of the institution, which must clearly communicate to teacher and students what is unacceptable and what to expect if you do it. Provide students with an educational where they have legal rights as well as responsibilities. So from the very beginning of their studies, they should have the courage to say no, the courage to stand up against sexist expressions, whether verbal or physical. It can be with the specific person, but if it doesn't work there, not everyone has the presence of mind, then provide an opportunity to do so at the anonymous email addresses or an independent psychologist to whom they can turn in this situation. And last but not least, I think it is very important that this issue is also present in education. I am not talking about sexist classes. I had an incredible positive experience when I was invited back to Bialystok for a short course and happened to be placed in a block of 8-10 hours with the director students in the 3rd class. In that year group, there were 4 girls. Of course, I prepared for the class, but in the last class, there was still 20 minutes left when I opened the group discussion with a very general question. Is there anything you would like to hear from me other than what I was just said? The answer was to tell me about my own experiences, what's like to be a woman in a theater, how to balance family and career, and what advice I would give them as a practicing director. I can honestly say I was surprised by their questions and requests. I started thinking about what I could give them as a guide. And then I started talking to them about the uplifting parts of this profession that can give you strength, that can give you energy. And I started telling them about the shadow side, and we pretty much stopped here. They wanted to hear more and more situations and stories and how I had to deal with this situation, what I would do differently today and why. And then I understood that this is a part of our work that cannot be taught in a classroom, but we can give you some insight and some ammunition so that when you encounter a situation like this for the first time, you don't get scared immediately, but you have something to work with. Have at least one solution. And at the end, they said that they especially thanked me for this class because they learned very little before about the human side of this profession. So I've since made it a point to sneak in some way to impart this information to the students. And also I would like to add that this problem is not existing only between teachers and students, but between colleagues as well. And we also have to look after it. In answer to the question posed in the title, does sexism exist in art higher education? My answer is yes, it exists. But because we know about it, we can do something about it. Thank you for listening.
Dziękujemy za to wystąpienie.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Now let's have Agnieszka Jachimiak. What is the outreach and the consequences of artistic? How far does it reach? Implications of power-oriented artistic interpretation in the process of making theater. Good afternoon. I'll be speaking English because I wrote it in English.
Because this is what I do when I write in an academic way. I will try also to be, not to speed it up too much, but I have to try out this first because I didn't have a chance before. So. Yeah, it works, it works, it worked. Wonderful. So this is the title of my presentation. How far does the outreach go? Implications of power-oriented artistic education in the process of theater making. And I will be talking about my own experiences as a theater director, as a dramaturg, but also as a former student of Theater Academy in Krakow. So my experience with Theater Academy started in 2011, when after 2 years of studies at the Institute of Polish Culture at Warsaw, I became a freshly appointed student of Theater Directing Department in Krakow. And in 2011, I entered the building of Theater Academy in Krakow, and I expected to find myself in a structure resembling my previous studying experience. In the Institute of Polish Culture, that you can find, I think, like 3 or 4 streets away from here, our priority as students was not to learn facts, but to transmit our singular perspective through creating our own narratives, based on theories and practical approaches we got to absorb. Then we were confronting these presumptions with our teachers, who would rarely dismiss our convictions or judge them as misguided. Most professors at the Institute were genuinely interested in the singularity of our reading of anthropology. Much to my surprise, Theater Academy in Krakow was ruled according to a set of drastically different principles than the ones I got acquainted with at the Institute of Polish Culture. 2 main departments, acting and directing, were placed in one building and filled with students who were blinded by joy that after beating the competition, they were chosen to study at these exclusive faculties. I quickly realized that despite the proclaimed atmosphere of creativity and artistic freedom, the general spirit in Theater Academy in Krakow was rather competitive and authority-oriented. Today, I would even describe it as highly patriarchal. Very soon, I found out that during their stay at Theatre Academy, students of acting department were often isolated from information on their learning process or their progress, which, comparing to the transparency of Institute of Polish Culture in Warsaw, struck me as almost unbelievable. Their time of studies was therefore full of tension and uncertainty. What is more, their position has been in constant jeopardy, as at the end of the first and second, and sometimes even of the third year, behind closed doors, the academic board decided whether each student proved to be fitted for the acting profession and could stay at the academy. So the selective process happened not only at the very beginning of the studies, but also was repeated after the first year and after the second year. In the directing department, we were also urged to accept the sway of authority. As future directors and dramaturgs, we were repeatedly encouraged to forget our interpreting habits and to rely exclusively on the expertise of the professors who taught at Theatre Academy. Today, I'm going to highlight how these dynamics affected the distribution of power within the broad realm of contemporary theatre production in Poland. Firstly, I am going to focus on the challenges that I recognize to be a result of highly hierarchical and often non-inclusive methodology applied in Theatre Academy. I will scrutinize how the master-oriented structure contributed to creating atmosphere of distrust within many rehearsing rooms and made it almost impossible to question and reshape theatre system that has been founded on dominancy of a leader figure. Then I will address the issues raised by Jacques Rancière in The Ignorant Schoolmaster in order to project a possible way out of the authority-based teaching system. I argue that the widely discussed concept of the ignorant schoolmaster has a potentially fascinating implications when applied in theatre making, a discipline which is characterized by oscillating around shifting ideas, heavily depending on current socio-political context and being in constant motion. So now it will be the first part. No. In 2013, together with theatre scholar and cultural worker Joanna Wichowska and theatre curator Goran Iniac, I began working as a dramaturg with Croatian theatre director Oliver Frljić, who was commissioned to stage Undivine Comedy by Zygmunt Krasiński in National Star Theatre in Krakow. At that time, I was still a student of Theatre Academy for 2 years, and I have been working as a playwright and dramaturg in theatres in various Polish cities. The performance Frljić was invited to direct was my fourth job in National Star Theatre in Krakow, a well-established and prestigious institution that was known to cherish its long theatrical tradition and to be a cradle of major theatre authors in Poland, such as Konrad Swinarski or Krystian Lupa. However, this work remained the first one that reshaped and reinvented my understanding of how the academic distribution of knowledge and power influenced the structure of repertory theatres. Our premiere of Undivine Comedy Remains was suspended, and no one has ever seen the outcome of 6.5 weeks of work. But the institutional consequences of the process initiated in Polish theatre by Frljić remained extremely visible and apparent for many years. The controversy that finally led to cancelling the show by then artistic manager of Stary Theatre Jan Klata was connected to the topic of the unfinished production. It was focused on Polish anti-Semitism and a blind spot of Polish citizens who were implicated in the genocide of Jews during the Second World War, and to the method of working proposed by Frljić. Croatian director came to Krakow with a set of political tools he would put at the actor's disposal, and with a deliberate lack of knowledge concerning the multi-layered network of prejudices, biases, and troubled relationships that characterized Polish society and its liaisons with other ethnic groups. This realm of information became something he would obtain in the process of rehearsing, by talking to people involved in the project and cultural workers invited by the dramaturgical team to broaden the context. Therefore, instead of imposing a narrative on a certain group, Frljić would aim at listening a story to the story that this group tells about themselves, and at reacting to it in a performative way. According to Freilich, theater, an element of a public sphere, is a political arena that can be occupied with potentially transformative ideas. In most of the performances, these ideas come from a director or a playwright whose ideology is imposed on actors that transmit someone else's voice. In that way, theater cannot become truly emancipatory as a medium, as the speaking subject is expected to formulate and often agree with concepts that are neither a result of their own consideration, nor remain in accordance with their standpoints. This type of incapacitation is rooted already in the teaching methodology applied in theater academies, based on the assumption that, as Freilich put it, quote, that students of the directing department should learn how to manipulate actors, and students of acting department should recognize directors' manipulations and manipulate them instead, unquote. 10 years ago, emancipatory discourse on the theatrical process of production was far from being widespread or even present in Poland. Institutional critique was relatively new, and most of the works dedicated to alternative modes of cooperations that would not be based on the authority of a singular artist were rather unknown. The mere idea that the stage presence of professional actors did not have to rely on creating a character in a given play, and could be derived from their own personal experiences and opinions, was highly uncommon in repertoire theaters. In my view, both narrowing the practice of actors to performing foreign texts and marginalizing their own lived experience were also rooted in the teaching method employed in Theatre Academy in Krakow. I identified 3 strategies applied by professors, and I have written them down, so... Nah. Give me a chance, please. Can I see? Yeah, please.
Thank you. Always forward. Over.
Thank you.
Right.
Always to the right. I go always to the left. That's my principle. So, I identified 3 strategies applied by professors of the Theatre Academy that translated from schoolroom to rehearsing room and contributed to creating a systemic inequality and imbalance in theatre structure. These strategies belong to manipulative techniques, but in my understanding, they exceed personal approach, as they are grounded in the power structure of Theatre Academy, and they are strongly supported by it. I argue that highly hierarchical and uneven system and personal willingness to take the top position within it were interconnected. As much as some people benefited from being in a position of power, others were often unconscious about harmful effects of the systemic discrepancies between teachers and students. The most damaging mechanisms I identified in the process of studying at the academy were keeping students in the dark about the assessment criteria. This is the mechanism I described before. Perceiving members of the academic community as a family. Creating a structure that relies on masters and their unquestionable authority. In Theatre Academy, the studying and teaching community was often described as a family. Even recently, on the website of Theatre Academy in Krakow, the Academy president, Dorota Segda, thanked to the retiring chancellor for his work and underlined that he, quote, became a member of our family forever, unquote, after years of, quote, treating his co-workers and members of his own, as members of his own family, unquote. As a student at the Institute of Polish Culture in Warsaw or Royal Holloway University of London, I have never heard school representatives describing the academic structure as a family. I understand that the family comparison was often used to underline the closeness of the bonds created at the Theatre Academy. However, I consider it to be a tool that reinforces the patriarchal structure of the school. Such a comparison has far-reaching consequences and implications. A studying environment itself does not resemble a family. Students and teachers usually are not related to each other. Students' upbringings were not influenced by the teachers. And in the face of a conflict or dissatisfaction with someone's performance or progress at the academy, the relation between a student and a teacher can be brought to a definite end. And this, as we know, does not happen in families. The act of comparing Theatre Academy to a family is about creating an affiliation that goes beyond professional relationship, is difficult to measure, and therefore grants one agent an almost unlimited power over another. Another tool that reinforced systemic imbalance was creating a master-oriented structure. When I started studying, each group of students at the acting department had its own tutor, whose official function was named a group's master. Established actors who were working at this position had control over the general artistic direction of the group they were teaching. They chose plays that were staged at the end of the semester and decided upon the program of studies, and influenced the students with their acting technique. Students of acting were not taught by theater directors, and they had limited access to theater studies. They had only one class dedicated to theory per year. Therefore, their main point of reference remained the method of acting proposed by the master and other professors. I witnessed how the family parallel and creating a master-oriented system were translated to the institutional structure of Stary Theatre, where many actors from the ensemble were also professors at the academy. Frilich was focused on tracing Polish anti-Semitism back to the 1950s and 60s, the post-war era when Polish society was heavily affected by the damage and that at the same time was troubled by recognizing its own implications in creating the anti-Semitic bias and facing its consequences. Undivine Comedy has been described as a work that contains anti-Semitic prejudice. Polish literary critic Maria Janion described Undivine Comedy as a masterpiece flawed by anti-Semitism. When we confronted the actors who participated in Konrad Swinarski production in the 70s with a query concerning the anti-Semitism of Undivine and of Swinarski's staging, the discussion was quickly overshadowed by a highly emotional tone of those actors who claimed that even posing such a question concerning potential anti-Semitic content of their master's work was improper, unjust, and absurd. Their argumentation did not relate to the content of the play nor to the staging. It relied on the conviction that such a loving and honest director as Swinarski could never produce an anti-Semitic message in his work. At that point, I understood how disturbing and dangerous the model of idolizing a master was. It eventually led to diminishing individual responsibility, blurring political awareness, and enforcing a hierarchical structure in which only those in power are creating ideological realm. Others, who are in inferior positions, do not feel that they are required to contribute to the ideological mindset, and they bear no political liability for the message they create. What is more, they may be often completely unaware what idea they support by participating in a certain project. And now I move to the second part. So this is the title, Ignorant Stage Masters, though today in the morning I thought that maybe it would be better to speak of ignorant stage scholars, just to avoid the master comparison all the time. In 1987, this is the year where I was born, Jacques Rancière, but it's a coincidence. No, we were destined, me and Jacques Rancière. So in 1997, Jacques Rancière published his reflection, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, 5 Lessons in Intellectual Emancipation. Upon an experience of Joseph Jacotot, who in the first half of the 19th century worked as a lecturer in French literature at the University of Louvain in the Netherlands. His students did not speak French, and he was unfamiliar with Flemish. Therefore, he decided to conduct an experiment. He gave the students a bilingual edition of Télémaque by Fénelon and asked them to read the original version with the help of the translation. According to Jacotot, in this way, students quickly mastered not only the reading skill in French, but were also able to write essays in the foreign language. Jacotot did not teach them a new language. He facilitated their process of learning. Jacotot's experiment inspired Rancière to rewrite the learning theory in a provocative and revolutionary way. At the very beginning of his essay, following Jacotot's thought, French philosopher makes two assumptions. A, the act of explaining is not crucial for the process of learning. Quote, understanding is never more than translating, that is, giving an equivalent of a text, but in no way its reason, unquote. B, there is no inferior and superior intelligence. People are born with equal intelligences. Following Rancière's recognition, I perceive the procedure of rehearsing for a performance as a process of learning. The difference between the academic way of obtaining knowledge and doing it in the rehearsing room relies in the distribution of roles. While in the academy, the roles of students and professors are distributed and defined in advance, in the repertoire theater, these parts are not set. However, they remain in a power relation. It is the director who is expected to have a higher understanding of the bigger picture, and who is expected to share his viewpoint with the outside, audience, critics, public opinion. Nevertheless, if we look at the process of theater production as a training, during which the knowledge is being constantly exchanged between equal participants, the preset dynamic of director explaining the idea to the actors becomes disrupted. I do not claim that theater directors should begin their work unprepared. On the contrary, I argue that they should offer as much as it is possible to exchange. In my view, theater work should not be about prioritizing one experience over another, but can rely on transmitting a set of experiences. In order to introduce a system of mutual learning to the rehearsing rooms, one should resign from supporting the notion of authority in every possible way. Following Rancière, I argue that in the rehearsing rooms of repertoire theaters in Poland and in the schoolroom of Theatre Academy in Krakow, knowledge and authority should not be perceived as interdependent. For now, the process of education at the Academy has been based on the presumption that students do not have the knowledge concerning how to act, direct, or write for stage, and they need to be taught by an authority. This pattern is then translated to the process of theater production, where an authority in directing teaches actor what to think and how to speak in order to transmit the idea of the theater maker. If only we undermine the necessity of referring to an authority in that stage context, we are left with a structure that relies on exchanging a wide range of various experiences by people who share similar positions. In my writing and directing practice, I often refer to strategies that aim at resetting the production system by distributing the roles in a different way, by giving actors a realm for sharing their practice, by asking performers about their opinion on the scene, its meaning, or general message, by incorporating the points of view that disrupt a dramaturgical line based on individual stance. Separating knowledge from authority, leaving the ideas authority and master behind. Incorporating opinions and performers' voices into the script, sharing authorship. My personal experience proves that opening a realm for interchanging knowledge and approaching the theater work as a field which is constantly rewritten by agents who create it throughout the process of production can lead to creating a fascinating outcome. In that way, all the people engaged in the production can identify with the effect, and they do not treat the final work as foreign or separated from their own artistic sensitivity or ideological standpoint. What is more, having the voices of actors incorporated in the script and contributing to creating the final score underlines the crucial aspect of theater work, its community dimension. I claim that by introducing the ignorant stage mastering that is founded on translating one set of knowledge into another, the initial disparity between different agents engaged in artistic process may be discontinued and replaced by a model of creating a common political platform within the contemporary art field. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję. Proszę Państwa, teraz połączymy się z Weroniką Szczawińską. Agata Adamicka jest z nami tutaj. Bardzo proszę wszystkich Państwa, którzy potrafią czarować, wysłać dobrą energię, zaklinać rzeczywistość, żeby nam się to udało, ponieważ mamy jakieś drobne kłopoty techniczne, ale zakładamy, udało się. I oby udało nam się także z dźwiękiem.
Cześć Weroniko, widzimy Cię już.
Cześć Agata, dzień dobry.
But we would like to check the voice. Can you say something more, because we had a little problems?
Okay. Well, hello. I'm a bit intimidated by being this big presence on screen.
Is it okay? Do you hear? Everything is right? Okay, great. So we'll also be speaking Polish, also because we'll be speaking about quite personal experiences here in this place, in this architecture. And I think also we'll really continue the topic that is present since the very beginning of the day, especially in this panel. So it can be seen as a continuity, I guess. So ciała, którymi jesteśmy, w stronę nowej polityki cielesności w Akademii Teatralnej w Warszawie.
To ja zacznę. Mam tylko prośbę jeszcze o... Okej, już teraz dźwięk jest w porządku, nie słyszę siebie. Dobrze, zacznę od opisu takiej krótkiej przechadzki ciała po Akademii. To będzie przechadzka osobista, to będzie przechadzka opisywana z perspektywy takiego ciała, jakim jestem, jak to ciało postrzega naszą uczelnię. A więc krótka przechadzka konkretnego ciała po Akademii. Wchodzę i napotykam bramkę. Wpadam na nią. Wiem, że jest konieczna, ale w jakiś sposób sprawia, że wejście na uczelnię
it makes me associate the entrance to the academy with obstacles. I also don't like the doors leading into the back. They're very heavy and strain on my left hand, which hurts after an operation. I go around the campus, I meet other bodies that I interact with and that I look at. I observe what sets of embodied practices are hidden in the rituals that accompany passing one another. Why am I so perplexed by the bodily movements that accompany very pretentious college greetings, that particular good morning pronounced with a particular bow? Is it because I see it as the embodied record of a hierarchy which has long-term consequences? I also wonder who in the corridors and in the common spaces, who feels at home and who doesn't, which bodies give themselves the right to occupy the space freely and which ones just pass through and scurry away, who has the right to powerful bodily expression, to sing freely, to raise their voice, to yell, to laugh out loud, to sit or to rest, to a safe space. If I enter a lecture room, there's a good chance that my body and other bodies will become trapped within a particular arrangement of benches and chairs. I don't always have the strength to move them. height don't always have the strength to fight the arrangement which instantly moves our bodies back in time to previous stages in our education when we were expected to sit and pay attention. If we look at this from the perspective of trivial everyday bodily experiences, we'll come to understand the places where we are. This applies to all of us who are bodily present in body in the Miodowa Street buildings. So we want to look at the experience of working and studying from the perspective of the body, the most intimate and the most political part of our existence, the locus and the medium that conveys our emotions. We want to talk about bodies which are inscribed in the physical, ideological and mental architecture of this place, as well as those for whom this place is still not accessible. Bodies shaped by this inherited architecture, deformed by it, produced in daily interactions, enclosed within walls built of bricks, traditions, beliefs, hierarchies, and systemic settings. I want to talk about the bodies that we are and whose fragility is what sparks revolution. In the announcement of the conference, we cite Paul B. Preciado, who describes the experience of recent years as follows. At a single time, different bodies have come about, objects of racist, sexual, and gendered violence, women's movements, trans movements, lesbian, intersex, anti-racist movements, and movements working for the rights of people with different cognitive and functional abilities. So this emergence of diverse bodies is our model for change, both for the change happening in society and the change we need at our school. The idea is not to speak from the standpoint of separate identity politics or the rights of various people, women, non-binary persons, students of acting, directors, disabled people, theorists, critics, trans people, producers, educators, racialized people, and so on, but to put the living body, the irreducible living body, at the center of our demands. Even its safety and its opportunities for expression within a joint social space, a body that belongs to us, even if it's the locus of a cultural record and the main object or target of techno-biological power, a body whose condition is fundamental not just for our quality of life, but also for the quality of the art we make. This is a huge task and a very big realm. So today we'll try to touch on this new politics of corporeity that we propose in order to invite you to jointly take part in shaping it. Today we'll be talking about actors' bodies because they are the ones who feel most strongly within this architecture, and in recent years they have been the ones to most visibly emerge. However, it's clear that this conversation should extend to all other bodies and that it has to be intersectional. The stakes are very high. It's a paradigm shift in our thinking to match our new definition of the theatrical medium. Along with this new definition, there emerges a space for new practices and sensibilities, for a new being together. The thinking, the reflection we are inviting you to is something that I'd like to start on by saying that it's the experience of actors' bodies filtered through my own experience as the student rights ombudsman. What I found intriguing is something that came back in many of the conversations. The figure of female tears as a special actor task. You're a girl, so you're supposed to be able to cry on cue. This is a definition of the professional skills that a young actress is supposed to have. The gender stereotype here is obvious. The young actress has to be able to exploit their sensibility, to show fragility or extreme emotions, crying, a bodily reaction that connotes fragility, weakness, suffering should be part of the repertoire of a young actress because it denotes what is essentially female. At this point, more than the gendered critique of female tears, I'm interested in the psychophysical mechanisms of its embodiment. So the stories that reached me were obviously related to crisis situations. However, I don't think that these were non-representative experiences. So, for instance, a lecturer might suggest that a female student who is unable to cry during the scene, she's asked to recall her most awful and traumatic experience of her life, to immerse herself in that experience and thereby find a way to cry. There's no room here to analyze the dangers that stem from such methods. Of course, a lot depends on individual circumstances. However, it's clear that this is a very risky procedure. After all, the young person is given no psychological support. They're under immense pressure, and they will have to do this task many, many times in the presence of her peers. She will need to revisit some of her greatest traumas stored in her body. What happens to the body under such circumstances? How does it impact the creative condition, the creative potential? And we need to ask such questions when devising this new politics of corporeity. The basic mechanism of trauma is dissociation, as Judith Herman shows in a book overviewing her 20 years of experience of working with trauma and PTSD. Dissociation is a state of being separated, cut off from one's feelings, one's experience that exceeds our adaptive capacity. Trauma leaves us paralyzed and mute, and either completely erases the traumatic experience from consciousness, although the body and the psyche still feel its crushing effect, or it leaves an incomplete, flawed memory in which meanings and emotions are obliterated. I don't want to settle whether there is real trauma in the re-traumatization I speak of in the school context. Most of the time, they're not processes that go that deep, and I don't want to point fingers at anyone. I believe that we are at a turning point when we're trying to come to terms with the traditional mechanisms built into this place, and more broadly into Polish theater as such. We're searching for alternatives. A part of this tradition is the legacy of Stanislavski and Grotowski, treated intuitively rather than in any systematic way, with the attendant conviction that the actor should refer to the memory of his most intimate experiences. When developing a role. We know that Stanislavski and Grotowski entail these big structures built with patience and precision and based on a constantly evolving practice. I leave aside the legacy of these two masters, Veronica and I, as a matter of fact, were the first to ask about the gender of the performer many years ago, launching a feminist queer critique of Grotowski in Poland. At this point, I just want to point out that this line of tradition in school practice is often the exact opposite of what Grotowski meant by working with the body memory or the body life. We'll come back to these notions because Veronica and I share the conviction that they can be an inspiration for the new politics of corporeity. However, I want to point out that working with the personal experiences of students is an area that opens up a great vulnerability, as I have found on many occasions in my work as the ombudsperson, and it's an unexplored area at the Academy, as also discussed in the report we talked about yesterday. So I would like to venture the thesis, which goes well beyond the figure of female tears. Dissociation, understood as anesthesia, numbness, or a distortion of one's relationship with one's own body and the experience recorded in it, is one of the most potent and still prevalent mechanisms at the Academy. It's an unwanted and unconscious side effect of these working methods that have important consequences of working with a medium that relies on direct co-presence and body-to-body communication. Let me stay with the figure of female tears, because I've also identified other violent mechanisms whose traces can also be found in the report. This is going to require condensing the theory of the citing, but hopefully we'll manage to stick through it together. So in a situation where a female student is unable to cry on cue, she's being forced to cry by the lecturer. How? Well, by crushing criticism, humiliation, undermining the purpose of her studies at the Academy, her fitness to be in this field. So by creating pressure on her, by breaking her down, and by really causing her to cry. So this actual emotion can then be used in the scene. It seems that this experience of crying is no breakthrough in working on the scene or the part, because it's a singular situation in real time. However, under these circumstances, the bodily memory may be activated, creating the initial traumatic scenario. So tears will come, but along with tears, the past emotions will also surface. There is a danger that this situation will develop into a repeated destructive pattern. And here, I would like to quote, with her permission, the words of a student that refer to this method of being forced to cry. She said, I learned then that in order to perform my task well, in order to put myself in an emotional state, I need to feel hopeless, weak, and good for nothing. That was the only way that I learned how to prepare for a scene. That is how I learned to cry. And then she continues, I was not aware of what was actually happening. I felt that this was an experience that was to foster my growth and that it was the right thing to do. End of quote. I feel the need to see the procedure described above and its outcomes within a broader systemic context, to understand the dynamics of this type of pedagogical relationship, and finally to ask, what does the person learning acting in that way experience? What does her body experience? The events described happened in the second semester of her first year. As we know, it's a turning point. Students are studying intensely. They are exhausted. They're spending whole days at school. They sort of lose touch with reality, especially as they tend to feel ambivalent, and they feel things from euphoria to despair. There's a range of feelings. So the report indicates that the selection procedures that we have here, although they were eliminated 2 years ago, nonetheless, students are still afraid of flunking. They feel totally dependent on the whims of the teaching staff. Under these circumstances, faculty gain unlimited power, almost, as it were, especially as they are the ones who are the people in the theater world. And the image they convey of the industry is of an extremely cruel, paternalistic field, which puts pressure on students. School, at the same time, is described as a place that offers easy conditions in relation to what students will endure in the future. All of this creates fertile ground for extremely dangerous mechanisms that Alexandra Stern describes in her book, Terror, Love, and Brainwashing, something she calls forceful persuasion. And these processes are a characteristic, for instance, of sects or toxic relationships. Stern calls on neuroscience and social psychology when analyzing pathological bonding. Pathological bonding occurs when a person under pressure feels obligated to maintain a good relationship with the perpetrator. Their reaction is to become particularly bonded with the anxiety-causing person who is in a position of power. This powerful person understands the threatening world outside. They can protect me against it. They can prepare me for it. And by sticking with them, by being on their side, I can belong. Fear and stress stimulate the secretion of cortisol. The more cortisol there is, the stronger the need to bond with somebody. So Stockholm Syndrome. But the need for security and comfort is not satisfied, or there is intermittent reinforcement because of the pressure, low self-esteem, the threat of being rejected. In these circumstances, the release of cortisol is not balanced by the body's natural opiates, which typify a state of security and trust. So this leads to a stalemate. There's both anxiety and attachment, which suppresses the activity of the orbitofrontal cortex and disrupts the connection between the left hemisphere, responsible for language and analytical thinking, and the right hemisphere, which is about feelings and non-verbal things. There's no homeostasis. Reflection is divorced from feelings. This leads to cognitive chaos and, again, dissociative disorders. I'm not suggesting that such relationships are in the majority at our school. Stern describes extreme situations. However, based on the report, I want to venture the claim that the mechanism of forceful persuasion is often an important component of the master-disciple relationship, one of the most popular pedagogical models at our school, and not just at our school, as we heard in previous papers. Relationships based on the master-disciple dynamic and this forceful persuasion mechanism are very unfriendly to creativity. They block the connection between cognition, language, analytical thinking, emotions, and the non-verbal sphere. Meanwhile, it's the autonomy that results from these connections that fosters creation. The student whose statement I cited said she was unable to understand what was happening to her. She also said that she initially believed this stress was meant to foster her development and that the lecturer was right. So this is a description of the body within this loop of chemical blockage, attachment and anxiety, toxic bonding. But let's pay attention to another consequence of such relationships. The student writes, I learned that in order to perform my stage task well, in order to bring up an emotion, I first need to feel hopeless, weak, and good for nothing. So what she is describing is essentially the internalized mechanism of forceful persuasion, which became part of her toolkit. And I don't have the words to describe how destructive, dangerous, and damaging this is, and how difficult to overcome in the future. I'd like to believe that such drastic situations are a thing of the past. At the same time, I understand that in order for them to have happened, they needed to be part of a broader system that allowed them to happen, a system that does not understand the body as the source of creativity. What puzzles me in this context is the typically Polish phenomenon of hazing, or the fuksówka, a brutal rite of passage that functioned in our acting schools for decades. It was a ritual that took place over several weeks, organized by the older cohorts for the incoming students. And my argument is that the function of this semi-formal, although institutionalized mechanism was to break these young people, to get them used to saying yes, to violate their boundaries, and to dissociate them from their bodies. The fuksówka, hazing, was an accelerated course in dissociation that older classmates funded for the younger students, believing that this would help them get through school. As a result of such mechanisms, rituals, and relationships, instead of the acting life body, this is Grotowski's term, what emerges is a phantom body, something in between a phantom amputational pain and a practice dummy. I know that this is a strong metaphor, but I could develop it also considering the perfect shape of practice dummies on which we learn, for instance, first aid, CPR, or dismembering these dummies during the exercises. Unfortunately, all too often, the most important stake in theater education is how much you can salvage from your organic, natural body. In 2019, Wojciech Malajkat, the rector of the academy, banned hazing. There's no longer selection after year one. And I hope female tears as a trope that's also disappearing. At the same time, I understand that banning these extreme practices doesn't change the system. The change needs to happen on a deeper level, across all levels. In fact, Veronica,
Okej. Wszyscy znamy ten truizm.
We all know the
Ciało
cliché.
jest dla aktora
The
narzędziem
body
pracy.
is the actor's
Ale co to tak
tool,
naprawdę oznacza?
instrument.
Kto
But what
decyduje,
does that
jakiego
mean?
narzędzia
Who
używa się
decides how
lub
this tool is
nadużywa?
used or perhaps
Zajmujemy się
abused?
ciałami aktorskimi w kontekście edukacji
We're talking about
artystycznej.
actor's body in
Na
the
stronie
context of artistic
internetowej naszej
education. On our
uczelni
university's
rekrutacja.
website, under the recruitment
Wymagania
tab, it
wstępne dla
says
kandydatów na
admission
kierunek
requirements for
aktorstwa.
candidates
Kandydat na studenta
in
radiofonii
acting.
powinien wyróżniać
An
się
acting
sprawnym,
candidate
plastycznym
should have
ciałem,
a
ze
fit,
szczególnym
artistic
uwzględnieniem
body,
sprawności fizycznej,
specifically
poczuciem
physically
rytmu,
fit.
koordynacją
They should have a
ruchową.
sense of rhythm and
Ciało postawione
motoric
tu na pierwszym
coordination.
miejscu,
The
łącząc je
body is put here in first place and linked to the
Jak
category
rozumieć
of fitness.
sprawność? Z jednej strony rzecz jest
But
oczywista.
what does fitness mean? On the one hand, it's obvious. It's a reference to a naturalized construction, the notorious norm, which artistic and scientific practice have in recent years helped deconstruct. On the other hand, this fitness proficiency is more. It's the predisposition of acting bodies, a special sensitivity to working with the body that goes beyond everyday practices. Does this type of proficiency, is it equated with physical fitness, understood as an exceptionally effective performance within an ableistically constructed norm? What happens if we think about acting fitness a little differently? And this is where we'll be talking a lot about Jerzy Grotowski. The issue of fitness appeared in the writings of Jerzy Grotowski, an artist whose commitment and dedication to thinking about the body was unparalleled in Poland. Dorota Sajewska, commenting on Grotowski, wrote that it was perhaps the only theory developed in Polish performing arts which puts the relationship between the body, the performer, and memory at the center of attention. We're aware of how controversial it might seem today to refer to Grotowski, especially in the context of change and transformation. We're aware how his tradition reinforced the hierarchical entanglement of theater culture and reproduced certain forms of patriarchal surveillance. And yet, aware of these entanglements, we want to turn to his writings today. In his writings, technical and anthropological, we see an extremely interesting connection of interest in craftsmanship and somatic reflection, which unexpectedly is in line with today's concepts of embodiment. We look into the archives of theater history to remind us that it has concepts that might help us transcend today's paradoxes. In his text, Exercises, published in 1979 but written in 1969, Grotowski summarized his experience in developing actor training and, with characteristic impishness, commented how physical training is understood in the theater of his day. In general, quote, in general, when talking about exercises, we do so with the assumption that it's a paragymnastic element designed to train fitness. The word recurs from Grotowski, who was a master of theater direction, a maniac of precision, fascinated with technique. He rejects the concept of training. I think that in all kinds of training, the evil comes from the misconception that one can supposedly develop various sectors of the body and liberate the actor, his or her expression. That's not true. We shouldn't train. The word training isn't accurate. Neither gymnastic, nor acrobatic, nor dance, nor gesture should be trained. Seemingly, this is astonishing, given that it comes from the leader of a group that for years became synonymous with perfection and in the area of physical work. In his exercises, however, Grotowski never rejects the categories of concreteness and precision. He approvingly goes back to Stanislavski's exercises that extend everyday actions, but creatively develop the concept of acting and relaxation. At the same time, he's critical of how Stanislavski was received in European and American theater. He shows that Stanislavski was turned into a plasma, something amorphous. He also rejects the attitude still found in art college courses that various sectors applied to an actor can develop their whole playfulness. Grotowski writes, an actor can dance. They can dance in a modern or classical way. They can perform dance movements in a more or less disciplined way. If they are to dance on stage, they can dance, but they will not create their own dance. They might repeat a dance dictated by somebody else. An actor might perform elements of pantomime. They can step in place. They can reproduce some signs. So they can do pantomime on stage, but for that purpose, they always use something that's not the result of a creative process. It's not personal, but something that was transferred in whole from another domain. Can an actor dance the pavan? Yes, they can. Can an actor do pantomime? Yes, they can. Only. The question is, what about creativity, the input of the actor? That is a key question. How to liberate the creativity, bring out the creativity of the actor, how to avoid the traps of amorphousness and training, charlatanism, and obsessive perfectionism. Grotowski's answer is surprising. What you need is to free the body, not to train its individual parts. You need to give the body a chance, to give it the chance to live. I've already emphasized that Grotowski ridiculed overtraining and ill-conceived relaxation, so that the release of the body, as he advocates it, is never without technique. In Exercises, he writes how, together with his colleagues, he searched for a method of body work that would combine opposites, spontaneity and discipline, but there is a strong emphasis on what is personal. Speaking, among others, of work based on assimilating details and finding personal physical impulses, Grotowski moves on to the key concepts of the entire texts, the notions of body memory and body life. Considering Grotowski's further artistic path, this can be read in a critical perspective. Dorota Sajewska wrote an interesting text based on the Exercises and analyzing the category of body archive. Opening up of the body memory doesn't mean accepting the fragmentary nature of experience, the frailty of the body, adapting to the disintegration present in it, but on the contrary, it is subordinated to the pursuit of ideal fitness. Without ignoring these observations, one can look at Grotowski's categories from the point of view of today's theories, which point to highlight the radically somatic dimension of our existence, valuing, appreciating the material dimension of our cognition. Perhaps, as Sajewska wrote, Grotowski saw in the body a sign of something else, which refers to the spiritual dimension not accessible through direct cognition. However, it's hard to ignore the fact that he understood the body's peculiar logic. The exercises developed by Grotowski and his collaborators were meant to unblock the body memory and body life, which I understand as getting in touch with one's somatics, an experience that meets and animates the proposed theater forms. Grotowski very aptly describes actors' problem with their bodies. Actors stretched between shame and narcissism, and actors who are embodied bodily and always at risk, always vulnerable. There's a lack of confidence in one's body, which is actually a lack of confidence in one's self, Grotowski stated. It's hard not to relate this observation to today's discussions about dissociation. It's also worth noting that interested in a kind of extreme theater, Grotowski stated, I really don't why, but transcending ourselves is possible only once we accept ourselves. This acceptance was to be achieved through a practice, one that would cause the body life to actively lead and process the proposed concrete sequences of theater action. We wondered what the consequences of Grotowski's thought could be outside of the practice conducted in the laboratory theater. What could be its consequences in the light of questions of acting corporeality and performance? Grotowski's proposal focuses on unlocking the individual potential of each person's body life, inherent and specific to that person. Radicalizing that thought, one can assume that such an appreciation of the seed of life, the germ of creativity, applies to everybody who has a body, who is a body, not just those who are normatively fit and above average skillful, but it also works on the level of feeling and practice, not appearance, and breaks with the almost scopophilic, voyeuristic regime of presenting acting bodies. Grotowski's thought and practice in today's theater needs to be supplemented, needs to take into account critical thought and practice, intersectionality that sees the normative action of the dominant white heteropatriarchal culture with a plural, fluid, and shifting perspective of different bodies and embodiments, oppression, resistance, isolation, distinctness, and alliances. But we feel that this type of dialectic of the concept of the inherent organic body life and the mechanisms of embodied techno-bio-power opens up a new and extremely refreshing perspective for both actor education and theater practice. What would happen to the category of acting prowess if we saw it not as a meeting of bodies selected according to a universalizing norm with a limited rigid set of exercises and practices, but an activation of corporeality that would make each person capable of taking theater action, of doing theater in a spirit of profoundly understanding their somatics? Wouldn't this free us from ableist dictates while preserving Grotowski's idea that the essence of performing art is skill and technique? The understanding of acting skill derived from the concept of body life also shifts the vectors of power in a significant way. A person who understands their corporeality, who has access to the history written in themselves, can consciously approach the work and the transgression of barriers. They can consciously raise boundaries, set boundaries, and take on challenges. The body consciousness that emerges from the proposal outlined here seems to bring together numerous themes present in the recent context of art education: issues of consent, boundaries, coordination of intimacy, and anti-discrimination policy. Meanwhile, thinking about each of these separately can lead to profound misunderstanding. Grotowski warned us against universal prescriptions. That's why we draw on his thought rather than want to reproduce the exercises he developed. It seems that any group or institutions with a theater practice might rethink how it understands reaching out to the body life. A direction I perceive with hope as a theater practitioner is strengthening the alliance between dramatic theater and dance, especially those dancers who fit into the broad field known as new choreography, reaching using bodywork practices derived not just from dance tradition but also from therapy, appreciating bodies for all their diversity. Marcelina Obarska, writing about new choreography, writes, "New choreography often focuses on the body in itself, not as a brilliant machine that can be trained to perfectly reproduce a dance score, but as an object of tender, attentive gaze, subject to politics, caught up in the order of restless everyday life, global changes, laws, and identity anxieties, anxiety around identity." That's why the body in the new choreography, in the new dance, is not a transparent, functioning, flawless device, but is living matter, living substance. And on that quote, and with that open vision of the body, I'd like to conclude our presentation. Okay, thank you very much. And the last presentation will be delivered by Monika Kwaśniewska, who will be telling us about alternative education. I'm glad that we succeeded. The connection worked. Thank you very much to our technical team for that.
Dobrze, a teraz jest dobrze. Tak, ja poczekam, aż porozumiem.
Okay, I understand you need a breather, so let's wait until
Instytucjami
people settle
teatralnymi,
down.
które najszybciej
The
zareagowały
theater
na
institutions
ruch
that
i
responded to the Me Too movement and
były
began
publiczne szkoły teatralne.
structural change
Najpierw
were
Emanuela
theater
Warszawska
schools.
i
First,
Wrocław,
the Warsaw and Kraków School, and then the school in Łódź. In all these places, the events were initiated by students as well as graduates who perceived sexual abuse and who extended that to include other forms of abuse, economic, mental, and structural.
Zestawiając początkowe działania
Comparing the initial reaction at the Theatre Academy in Warsaw and then in Łódź with what happened in Kraków, one can identify two strategies. In Warsaw, the call-outs were publicly voiced and launched a process of structural change. This conference is a part of that process. One of the responses were artistic projects by students who taking advantage of the greater latitude, liberty given to students, are thematicizing abuse in art. I'm referring to two performances, productions, Hymns and Klubben. The Warsaw Academy is in the forefront, but in the Kraków Academy, it was artistic productions, diploma pieces or exams that led to revealing, bringing out abuse and abusive mechanisms in education and artistic work. These weren't official complaints, but owing to their content, their message, they needed to be seen in an institutional context, and then a code of ethics was implemented and ethical ombudspersons, the post of ethical ombudsperson. There was also anti-discrimination training, and hazing was banned, and intimacy coordinating was introduced. But the productions that shed light on abusive mechanisms in the school are regularly produced. There are also public call-outs of graduates. The productions I mentioned were, I feel, were a type of artistic exploration that allowed them to take a closer look at the mechanisms, sources, and consequences of abuse in education and art, and led to rethinking, verifying, and modifying the methods of approach towards devised theater. It was also analysis of mistakes made in the production process, ethical mistakes. I see these projects as a type of alternative theater education that complements official curricula. I will be looking at the production of three productions, The Rape of Lucretia, Othello, and Year One. I relied on the productions on a master's thesis written by persons involved in the productions, published articles and interviews with the creative teams, and their answers provided to my questions, for which I am very grateful. In the text also, the text has two perspectives: the perspective of actor and director dramaturg. The framework of my analysis is artistic investigation and devised theater. Artistic exploration research actually combines the creative process with an academic process to generate and disseminate knowledge using a hybrid methodology. The format of artistic research is broad. I will be talking about how it's done in Poland. These projects, there were also artistic, academic, as well as current affairs. This was more horizontal than hierarchical. It didn't involve a rejection of abandonment of creative function and responsibility, but thinking together, sharing perspectives and agency. Hashtag the rape of Lucretia was produced in 2018 as a diploma piece in the acting department of the Kraków Academy, directed by Marcin Lieber. The dramaturg was Martyna Wawrzyniak, who was then a student at the stage directing department, specializing in dramaturgy. Originally meant to be an adaptation of Shakespeare, including documentary content about the Me Too movement, it became a montage of scenes on rape culture. It also had to do with theater education that perpetuated stereotypes about gender roles, using vulgar and sexual references. The script, the text, was devised in rehearsals and relied on research and improv. With the hindsight, it turned out to be an important process, artistically and in terms of knowledge. The dramaturg, Martyna Wawrzyniak, who worked on the piece as a student, wrote her master thesis as an analysis of the dramaturgy of a rape story in the context of secondary victimization and emancipation. In one of the chapters, she wrote about working on the production of hashtag the rape of Lucretia. This was a way of analyzing her own tools and decisions as a dramaturg. The questions she asked herself and other participants had to do with the onstage depiction of sexual violence. Her attitude towards the documentary material and what it's like to work on testimony, on personal accounts of sexual abuse. Her approach contrasted with the elaborate form of Shakespeare's poem describing the suffering of a raped woman and the studied poses. So she wrote a script in defiance of artistic representations, depictions of rape. She referred to knowledge learned and about the way performance sexual abuse affects the body and mind of an actor. In the collective monologues, there was mention of the obligation to carry out transgression and the sexualized language used by some lecturers at the academy. This was accompanied by a fear of criticism from the institution in which the diploma piece was being produced. In rehearsal, they wondered what could be said on stage and what risk was involved with speaking of your own experience of violence or abuse. The creative team was reaffirmed by some sort of peer solidarity and the cooperation with the director, who is not a graduate of a theater school, of a public theater school. So the process didn't reproduce this behavior. For the creative team, for the actors working on the production, led them to rethink or even change their attitude regarding Me Too. This was thanks to profound research done by all participants. As actress Melania Grzesiewicz writes, confronting the clash of different perspectives brought out different points of view between male and female actors, but also was an opportunity to discuss these differences. For Weronika Warchoł, this led her to carry out research. The actress was originally skeptical, was reluctant to talk about sexual abuse, but inspired by a video online, she put up a mattress in school where it said Me Too, encouraging students to write their own testimony, and she showed the artifact, the document in the production.
które udzieliły
The-
swoich głosów.
Katarzyna Neyman, Melania Grzesiewicz, and Weronika Warchoł, female actresses taking part in this production, said that it encouraged them to think about abuse in theater and rethink boundaries in the artistic process. This affected their attitudes, helps them set boundaries, gave them a sense of agency and creative freedom. Another production is Othello.
Othello was created in 2019 as an exam piece at the directing department of the ASD in Krakow, directed by Wiktor Bagiński, along with an acting with a team of actors. All of them are mentioned here. The process was lengthy, but irregular. It was done after school. So it was irregular. They worked after school, after class, doing physical meditation and improv work. Bagiński's assumption was to weave fiction with reality. This was to make the audience feel uncertain. This feeling was very uncomfortable, as the uncertainty related to rape. The key scene in the performance was a fictional monologue by Bielecka, Natalia Bielecka, the actress, sitting near the front row in a very non-theatrical way, using private names, talked about a rape, how she was raped by another actor, Damian Sosnowski, who was on stage at the time. She also said that in order to turn that trauma into art, Bagiński had convinced her to make it into art. The performance was very provocative. The boundary between fiction and reality, the role of trauma and manipulation in the theater process, the reliability of testimony and nakedness on stage. There were two differing performances accompanied by a secret performance stretched out in time over several months. Bagiński asked the team not to tell what is true and what was made up. This situation generated additional tensions and gossip, but it also made it more difficult to exit the role for the actors. After going off stage, the actress and actor remained in character. Also because people would ask them about whether the things said in the play were real. This performance was interrupted after several months during a festival organized by ASD, whose purpose was to promote the work of directing students in Polish public schools. Bagiński began a talk after a performance saying that everything on stage had been made up. Although not everybody believed him at this point, the project helped gain knowledge about boundaries in the artistic process. Sosnowski devoted a lot of room to it in his master's thesis. Bagiński is wondering whether or not to write a PhD on the subjects that this Othello initiated in his work. So they also presented a summary of the research. Bagiński gave me an interview before he converted to Islam. Bagiński is the only black director in Poland, having studied at an academy. Thanks to the award he got for Othello, he made his debut at TR Warsaw, one of the most important theaters in Poland. Key themes in his work are blackness and racism. This he combines with sexual violence. In hindsight, he was critical of his creative assumptions and beliefs that as a black Pole, he was catering to the needs of the white audience and theater authorities. Also, manipulating fictional testimonies is something that he considers ethically problematic today because it may have negative impact on the dynamics of the discussions on rape culture. This reflexive autoanalysis also referred to the process of working he got in touch with the actors to ask them how they felt after that process. The conclusion he came to was that psychological supervision was needed in such risky artistic projects because while working, the focus on outcome reduces attentiveness to issues of security. For Bielecka and Sosnowski, working on Othello was an important experience in the context of looking at boundaries and psychological security in the actor's work. Their feelings during the project and their conclusions are sometimes similar but also contrasting, which points to the need to individualize approaches while building safer models of work. Bielecka and Sosnowski consciously and purposely explored in Othello a performative acting formula that blurs the boundaries between themselves and the role. In the case of the actress, the process was turned to the outside world. She did not identify with the rape victim. While creating her role, she studied, she read testimonies and watched documentaries. So this was para-documentary acting. Following the assumptions of the director at one rehearsal, she told a fictional rape story as her own. When she realized Bagiński believed her, she said it was made up. This is how she tested her own intuitions regarding her acting tools, which she could use to cloud the audience's perception, to manipulate the audience. For Sosnowski, the blurring of boundaries between himself and the role was turned inwards. So the actor did not try to... he describes the role as breaking himself, acting masochism, fears, exploring extreme and dark states. He also speaks of a sense of guilt for something he had not done. And his physiological reactions, including nausea and vomiting. And this indicates that such methods have a destructive influence on the actor's psyche. At the same time, Sosnowski says that working on this exampiece was a good space to undertake such risky actions. Othello was one of the most important experiences in his actor's education and an important element of his self-exploration process. However, he never wants to repeat that kind of experience again. Another field of research for Bielecka and Sosnowska was the relationship between the director and the actors. Both stated that work occurred in a good, friendly atmosphere, open to co-creation, thinking together. However, they see the relationship with Bagiński in a different light. The actress found the director to have been manipulative, but she thought they were so obvious, so blatant, as not to be a problem. She considered the whole process transparent and relatively safe, which allowed her to embrace such risky performative gestures. Sosnowski, otherwise, initially, when the director asked them to write inner monologues, he called it a pretext to analyze private acting personalities. He also found it manipulative how Bagiński made Sosnowski go on stage naked. Initially, the director did not say this openly, but he alluded that that's how it should be done. While on an outing, he also suggested that the rape might be recreated on stage. Eventually, the actor only read a description of the rape. However, the director says he never forced nakedness upon the actor. He only told him that nakedness would make the scene more intense. Also, working on Othello made Bielecka and Sosnowski very cautious about being manipulated. For Sosnowski, it was also a lesson in self-care. So Othello is an example of combining good and bad practices, some of which were rejected. And the final example is first year. This was also an exam piece done at the drama directing department of the AST, although Zdenka Pszczałowska was the examinee. She worked with Maja Wisła-Szopińska, who in 2018 had been expelled from the school. There were also other collaborators. The point of departure for the performance were fears of being kicked out of the school during the first year. It used to be called the selection year. The performance was an autoethnographic study of sorts. Pszczałowska and Wisła-Szopińska started with their own experiences, but they analyzed them in a broader context. The performance had three parts. Part one, we observe behaviors among those studying directing and dramaturgy who are awaiting their work to be evaluated. Part two, there's a sort of TV show, TV contest. Part three, the results of the survey. There are surveys about the pieces produced. So Pszczałowska and Szopińska designed two surveys, one for those studying directing and dramaturgy, and a second one for teachers regarding different aspects of studying and learning in first year at AST. Aside from this, they carried out many individual interviews with students. They started by making the argument that various factors were at work, such as non-constructive and humiliating feedback after exams, which led to stress, tensions, and uncertainty that accompanied people's first year in theater education. The surveys confirmed this, pointing to a systemic problem. This was important because discussions about violence at theater schools in Poland were accompanied by the belief that the problem only applies to acting departments. Moreover, a study done 2 years after anti-abuse and anti-discrimination measures were implemented at the AST showed that those measures were not enough. The survey results also went hand in hand with interviews with students. Most of these conversations had a therapeutic dimension. The conversations were a platform to share difficult and similar experiences and emotions safely. They allowed to include those individual experiences in a broader picture. Problematic relationships were found to exist between the acting and directing department. The performance team was composed so as to have people work together, people who knew each other, in order to create a sense of safety and openness to artistic risk. The script, the text came out, developed gradually in collaboration. On part one, they worked using some structured improv work. So acting students played directors, thereby manifesting their perceptions of who directors are. This showed this was a kind of identity performance, you could say. Also, the teamwork and the sense of mutual trust made it so that at the end of work on the performance, the actors said they were disappointed with the fact that no surveys were done among acting students. This complaint became part of the performance. In the final scene, Balicki said that for acting persons, working with directing students was an important educational experience. He emphasized that they too are often get very painful feedback from exam evaluation committees. So whereas in part one revealed certain stereotypes about directors as seen by actors, in the finale and in the surveys, they brought down stereotypes about actors seen as blind and dumb tools for directors to work. Emotions came up as well. Pszczółowska risked a lot. It was her exam piece. She was in third year. She invited people to work with her, including somebody who had been expelled. The survey results were going to be presented at random. Most of them were critical of the school. Some cited or pointed fingers at specific individuals. Tension was augmented by the nervous atmosphere around the piece that she heard about from her colleagues. Today she says, if people at school had not realized the problems at the school, those emotions would not have come up. Despite fears, there was no self-censorship or censorship. The director was encouraged by the importance of the theme. She was supported by one of the teachers and other collaborators. And she also found it very helpful to analyze all of her decisions, to consult with them. The exam piece was well received, but no institutional consequences came about. AST did not propose any institutional support to develop the research further. Moreover, even at the Young Directing Festival, they only featured a very bad recording of the show at 11 a.m. on a Sunday. So this goes against the attitude of the Warsaw Academy and its authorities who went as far as to commission thorough research on abuses at the school. So I studied acting in the directing department, said Bielecka. The pieces described above explored violence in the educational process. In The Rape of Lucrece, it studied violence in Othello. It was violence between directors and actors. In first year, relationships between students and faculty. This research was characterized by personal involvement in the topic, which entailed risk that was taken on thanks to trust between creators. Close collaboration between acting, directing, and dramaturgy students was an important feature. Such collaboration is not part of the curriculum. For the directors, this involved unpaid work after hours. For the dramaturg, it was not really an obvious course to pursue. Thanks to these collaborations, artistic processes became collaborative creations, providing room for experimentation and flattening hierarchies. The analytical character of the works led to self-analysis and revising one's tools, situatedness, and working methods from an ethical perspective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We don't have a lot of time for any summary, but perhaps we might. Agata, Kata, Agnieszka. In the meantime, taking advantage of this moment, I don't know if Weronika Szczawińska will be joining us. I just wanted to say that listening to your presentations, I was trying to bring it down to a single example, to some kind of instance, I'm trying to imagine a teacher, a female lecturer, teaching acting about my age. Say she's 47. Let's imagine that. So this is somebody who listened to these presentations. She gets it. She wants to implement it, but she's completed school in the way described. She's still working through her own traumas, her own issues. And she wants and she needs, she's working with young people, young adults who, when they're starting out at the academy, working with emotions, that this is the first time they've named their emotions. It's the first time they've spoken about their emotions, some some students. And additionally, she's seeing more neurodivergent people. So which way to go? What kind of step should I make if I wanted to be with the times without harming anybody, without having the new tools, because these tools are just being developed, and additionally in conditions of precarity, because most artists of the middle generation are also moving from project to project. They're still looking for some sort of stability. So what do I do as a concerned lecturer? I think that first you'd need a long conversation. You'd need to talk over a number of issues, a number of circumstances. And what I think is most difficult is that the hierarchy in learning, and this was always the case, that the professor comes first and the student comes second. But if we want to teach, if we want to educate our future peers, our future colleagues, and they should catch up, and they should outgrow or transcend, cross these boundaries. So how do we encourage them? How do we be friendly? How do we be supportive colleagues, but still keep them at some sort of distance so as not to cross a line? We want to open a door for them, but we need a lexicon, we need a vocabulary that we need to work on, and for that we need a long conversation.
To ja tylko dodam do tego pytania, bo ja jestem trochę wrażliwiona na takie...
I'm a little sensitive when it comes to talking about change at academies, changing teaching, as if it were impossible, dangerous, and very difficult or unfeasible. I think, at least for me personally, the change that we're witnessing is making things easier, and it comes as a relief. A dozen or so years ago, I had a problem. When working with acting students, I would need to make demands or use their sensitivity, their emotions, without having the instruments. I might hurt them because I didn't have the right tools, the right way of talking about them, or how to give them assignments. Now that the range of methodologies is getting wider, we know how to draw the lines in a performance, we know how to create safe situations and how to use your experience so as not to be abusive or exploitative, so as to avoid abuse and extraction or exploitation. So, and thanks to these new tools, we're not hurting people, we're not perpetuating any mechanisms. And now the persons speaking today would have been in a disadvantaged situation previously. I think that today it's an advantage. It's much easier to be a stage director than it was even 15 years ago.
Ale ja jednak bardzo sobie wyobrażam pozycję tej osoby, którą Beata opisała. I myślę, że ona jest trudna bardzo.
The situation described by Berta is very difficult, and I think I really want teachers, lecturers not to feel
No, nie mieli poczucia, że
I would hate. I don't want lecturers to feel that what we're doing is directed against them. Is trying. I also don't want to sound naive,
tak, że
because it is the case that we really need to identify. We need to be aware of the abusive mechanisms and the damage they do, and this damage we're trying to is really profound, runs deep. I still believe that what's at stake in this school, that what this is all about is how much of yourself you can keep safe in the educational process, how much, and this is really shocking. It's
jakby takie całkowite,
so it shows you the in total.
całkowitą utratę sensu.
It shows the loss, absolute loss of meaning. But if we were able jointly to reveal, to discover that it's important, that obviously some nuance is necessary here, and this is a simplification on my part, but I think if together we were able to bring it out into the open, and I think this is a very good time to do so. Wojtek Ziemilski and I we were talking to Wojtek just now, and we realized, Wojtek Ziemilski, that we don't know anything really. We don't have any written methodology on how teaching is and learning is done, and that's a secret because we don't really explore this. We don't invite people to think about this along with us, even theater scholars from our school, from our department, from our theoretical course. Because for years there's no room to think about, there's a dearth of thinking. I had 1,200 pages. It was 1,200. I drafted the collected writings of Grotowski. I was one of the editors, and this is the only profound, systematic kind of discussion of these issues that we have. And I feel that several years down the line, as I said, opening the conference, this is a long and winding road ahead of us, and I know we have to work on our approach to work, on the way we work, since we're all equally at sea. Perhaps there's no reason to be afraid of this. We shouldn't fall into a self-accusation, but we need to be aware that the work that we've done over the last 4 years is now opening up to the curriculum, the syllabus, toolkit. This is something we need to start doing. Just one more thing. It is important, and we need to realize that the new generations have a different need, different needs. They require different things. I have 2 kids of my own, and they have a different way of communicating. They have entirely different needs. And I think, even if we wanted to give them what we were given, even if we believed that this was the best way to go, we still need to adjust it, adapt it, to meet the demands of the recipients of the generation that we're addressing. These are people who will be redefining, reinventing idiom on stage and the theater. Thanks. I just like, as I said in the paper, I want to follow up on what Agata Adamiecka said, because like Agata, I believe, or I can imagine, the problems a lecturer would have, that the lecturer that Beata referred to, and I imagine that working to achieve change is very difficult. Like, we don't have the methodology, we don't have the tools, and we have in our bodies and in our practice, we have this residue, residue of very difficult, very wrongful practices. But if I were to come up with a positive answer to Beata's question, I'd say sometimes it's worth starting with the basics. Just see who's in the room with you. What are the potential tensions? What is the hierarchy of power? How are we sitting? Does everybody know what they're in the room for? Does everybody know what's expected of them? Does everybody know what they're supposed to learn? What's the point of it all in a broader context, educational context, right? So I think we need to keep learning, keep being open to new tools, new methodologies, integrated perspectives, but you can start with something more practical. You can start by not ignoring the obvious. If you're in a group, you're reenacting performances that you've grown used to, that you've absorbed, knowledge, authority, being, existing in a theater school, which is inherent into the educational process. So this might be banal, super banal, but just take a look around and see who you share the space with and start asking questions. See differences in experience, knowledge, the way somebody sees art, the way somebody sees the world, and work with that. I think that's the first step, to go outside your norm, to go beyond what you consider to be normal, where you don't see difference, where you don't see other people and their boundaries and what makes them unique. Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Czy jakieś słowo komentarz? Jest?
Just a comment. Apologies. There's always somebody who says this isn't a question, it's a comment. My name is Wojtek Ziemilski. I beg to differ with my colleague Agnieszka Jachimiak, who said that it's easy and nice and that we should be happy. There's just one word that I would use to sum up this time is a mess, a commotion, looking for who we want to work with. Veronika mentioned that, looking around and seeing who's in the room with you, who you're working with. But that's also setting out into the jungle, like you're looking around, but those people are also looking around, they're lost, and they've also been shaped by the fact that they live or emerged from an established culture. Everybody's negotiating the position they want to be in. So when we're teaching, what we're dealing with is with a shifting subjects, which then translates into the way we work in theater, where it would seem that you have people who are clear, who know more or less who they are, at which stage of the... But it might turn out, and this happened to me, that during a very open process, what I believed to be transparent and shared and common, but then all of a sudden, very bizarre responses come out, which are clearly the product of a culture of hierarchy, of the patriarchy, and something that the persons concerned weren't even aware of. They didn't realize that they had it in them. So as a teacher, as a director, that's the world you find yourself in. It's a muddled up world. It's a confusing, messy world of shifting perspectives. So I don't know what I'm standing on. It's the ground is. Well, let me just explain myself briefly. This was a generalization, obviously. I believe that, we know that it's us, we're the teachers now, and we're working with students. That's difficult when we have to renounce violence, and violence is an effective and fast means to an end. Obviously, it's very harmful, hurtful, but violence, coercion was used in the theater schools for a long time because it was effective. And generalizing, it's a relief to me compared to the artistic education that I had. I had a teacher throwing chairs at me, but this won't happen again. I know this won't happen again, and that's a relief. As teachers, we know that it would be easier to vent your emotions quickly, but we have these obstacles. We have this where you need to take other people into account, their feelings and so on. It's difficult. It's a difficult process, but it's still a relief compared to what we had before, to the type of abuse we had to suffer 10, 15 years ago, or the abusive tools that we were taught, abusive methods that we were taught. Anybody who graduated art school must have encountered abusive practices that they were expected to internalize. Justyna Sobczyk from Theater 21. I think in commenting on what Wojtek said about the mess, the sloppiness of the situation, the uncertainty, I want to see this work, this cooperation as a sphere, as a zone of negotiation. We're all looking, we're all searching, but what happens between us, we're looking for consent on both sides. Okay, I have my own confusion, but I'm trying to deal with that. And I'm also hoping that the other party is doing the same. It's an encounter, and I keep asking, is that okay for you? It's what Agnieszka said. It's like Agnieszka said, what do you think about this scene? Do you consent? Do you agree? Do we want to show it this way? Is this the way we want to play it? And this relieves us, this kind of opens us up, and we can verify, we can validate the way we see theater in someone else's eyes. And with mutual consent, we produce a work, an end product. And this session, Ula Kijak said that there's a lot of things we haven't been taught, and there's a lot of work to be done on your own. But it's also interesting that actor training and theater school is kind of infused by neuroscience and neurodidactics. I was told and I accepted that professional actors are prepared to work using the Stanislavski method. I graduated theater pedagogy in Berlin, and I realized that I would not be working with graduates of drama schools, but then it turned out that actors have a problem. And like you said, revisiting the trauma leaves its mark. But it's still very interesting that acting, teaching, training, and drama school as an enclave, the enclave which it was, which is now letting in neuroscience, developmental psychology, neurology. So stems from the body, and the body is always in a process, part of a process. So doing this in the cause of art, we're also to blame for, and I think this is an opportunity, and it's also a wake-up call getting together with experts who can wake us up from our dream of what theater ought to look like and provide us with concrete solutions that might be translated into strategies on the stage. The crying, what Agata said about forcing women to cry, that's really poignant, but it's also very inspiring how to extract tears without forcing someone to wallow in their kind of grief or trauma, because it didn't begin in theater school. We're educated in an abusive educational system, but we all survived. So using onions to make people cry, but nonetheless, we survived, and we still have ideas to reform the system. And this will be the last question, otherwise we'll only have half an hour.
Komentarz. Nie wiem, jakoś tak bardzo we mnie to zostało i mam potrzebę powiedzenia tego głośno.
So there's one more thing that I need to say out loud, because I'm hugely impressed by this panel and this highly systematic, condensed knowledge that we're getting, these practical observations. And I think one common thing in your papers, also relating to the question you asked about what I'll be taking away from this conference, it's very important when we meet, when we come together in this room, regardless of what side we're on. Maybe there are no sides, but everybody has boundaries, and not only do we have to recognize other people's boundaries, we have to recognize our own. We have the right to be aware of our emotions, as well as the obligation to be aware of others' emotions. That's a good point of departure, seeing yourself, seeing your boundaries, and being aware of your emotions. That's my takeaway from this panel. We really have to be wrapping up because we have very little time. I'm sure this discussion could go on. Thank you very much to all of our speakers, Kata, Agnieszka, Agata, Veronica, and Monica.